Before we get started, we need to understand our requirements. At a very high level, we have two different kinds of tables that will be in our model. We have a table that contains numeric information that we want to aggregate for reporting. We're going to call that our facts, and that will be called on-time performance. I'll just call it performance. And that table, imported from text files, will contain a flight date, an airline ID, that's just a numeric ID that can be used to look up the airline information, the origin, airport code, destination, 3-letter airport code, and some fact information. We'll just generically refer to that as delay information, but there are actually several numeric columns containing the number of minutes that flights were delayed for various reasons. So this isn't a complete set of data. In order to be able to get the airline names and be able to get the airport names, we need to use lookup or dimension tables. So we have an airline table, we have an origin airport table, and a destination airport table. Since these are lookup tables that have the corresponding codes and IDs, these will have relationships between them. And now that we have a very rudimentary set of requirements, we can get started. Let's take a quick look at our data files. So starting with our fact tables, you can see that I have two folders. In the 2016 folder, I have 12 files that were downloaded from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, one for each month. Taking a look at those files, I'll just open this up in a text editor using Notepad++. You can see that this is a standard comma-separated value file where the first row has the column headers and then individual values are comma-separated with the string or text values in double quotes. Pretty common stuff. One row in this file represents one flight on a date by an airline from an airport to an airport with delay and other important flight information. So that's my fact data. And if we look at the dimension data, here I have my airlines. We can take a look at that in Notepad++. There again, you can see the column headers. There's the airline ID, the name of the airline, the short code, and then there's actually a URL to the logo for that airline. And the rest of these files are very similar. We have one file that's actually in a JSON format. And so if I were to open that in Notepad++, we would see that that is organized in JSON, which is a little bit like XML. I just have the latest version of Power BI Desktop installed, which I can install from powerbi.com. I have a 64-bit version of Windows, so it installs the 64-bit version of Power BI Desktop. When Desktop opens, it opens this splash screen that gives me the ability to get data. Now, if I don't happen to have this splash screen open, I can also use the standard menu, which would be right over here. On the home ribbon, I can use Get Data. That'll give me a very similar experience to what I'm doing right now. I just click on Get Data. Now, as you can see in the Get Data dialog, there are many data connectors and data providers available for Power BI. Now, with the exception of using Direct Query or Direct Connect to Analysis Services, importing data from any of these data sources will be a very similar experience to what you're going to have working through these basic steps, importing data from text files. And in the Get Data dialog, I'm going to choose Text CSV. We're going to import our airline data. So I'll choose Connect, browse to the location of that file, which is right there, Airlines. I'm going to click Open. And you can see a preview of the file. I'm going to go ahead and click Edit, which will leave the query editor open. This is typically what I'll do. The first thing that I always do when the query editor opens is I go over to the name of the query. This will be the name of the target table in my data model, and I make sure that that name is what I want. We could go ahead and leave it as airlines. I'm going to go ahead and just use the singular form of each of my table names. It's not super important that you do that, but I just want to be consistent. Now this is a very simple file, and the next thing that I'm going to do is just check the names and the data types for each of these columns. You can see that ID is going to be hidden, so it really doesn't matter what it's named, but I might change that to airport ID if it's something that I wanted to expose to users, which it's not. You can see that that's a whole number based on the icon that I see there. I'm going to leave that as is. The rest are text, and that's good. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that one alone, and then we'll go to New Source, and we can import our destination airport and our origin airport files. I'll choose text CSV, and I'll choose airports. Now, note that in the first row of this file, these are actually the column headers, and we're going to watch to see if the editor figures out whether it should promote the column headers like it did in my airline file. See how the column headers are up in the headers rather than in the first row. So click OK. Watching for that, you can see that the designer didn't do that in this case. The reason that it didn't is because these are all text values, and the query editor couldn't distinguish between the text value code and the text value UXM. It doesn't understand that that is a column header. So I need to promote those headers by using this option, use first row as headers. So that pushes that first row up into the headers. Now I'm going to check the data types like I did before. Text, text, text. That's all good. There are no numeric values in this table. And notice that in this airports file that the column header for two of these columns contains the word destination or an abbreviation, which suggests that this is destination airport information. Turns out that it can also be used as origin airport information. So I just need to keep that in mind. But to that point, I'm going to go ahead and use this file as my destination airport table. And I'm also going to use the singular form of airport just for consistency's sake. The other thing that I want to do is I don't like this value right here, this role underscore unknown. That seems very cryptic to me, and because I want my users to have a user-friendly and simple experience, I want them to see values that seem friendly to them. The query editor is a very Excel-like interface. It should be familiar to people who know how to use Excel. So you can see that the designer behaves like an Excel table where the column headers have these little drop-down filter lists. And if I use that drop-down arrow, I can actually see a preview of the values in this table. And the designer warns me that if it were a really long file, it may not have loaded all of the data, but it's a good representative sample. But you can see that other than the role underscore unknown, the other values are pretty user-friendly. I'm happy with those. I'm not happy with this role unknown. So I'm going to change that just by right-clicking on any of the cells that contain role unknown and choose Replace Values. So we'll just replace role unknown with the word unknown. Click OK. And I'm happy with this table. So rather than importing this table again, which would use up more memory and would require a little more work, I'm actually just going to use what I've already done as the origin airport table. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to right-click on the destination airport query, and I'm going to choose reference. What that does is it utilizes that file. It doesn't import it again, but it just uses it as another table. So you can see that there's another query added, but it only has one step. It just uses the other one as a source. And I'm going to rename this query as origin airport. We can get rid of the number at the end, press enter after I've made a change. But you can see that the column headers are the same as the destination airport, so we're going to change them here to origin. Anywhere you see dest or destination, I just want to change that to origin. Press enter. So you can see that there are only two steps in this query now. The source, which is inheriting from the destination airport query, and the rename column steps. Okay, I'm happy with that. I'm going to skip the distance group file because that's a little more advanced and we don't need it right away, but I am going to import my delay group file, which is a JSON file. So I don't see JSON on the list of new sources, so I'm going to click More. And there's the JSON format right there. We'll click Connect, and that shows me my delay group file. Now the JSON structure is a little more complex than the CSV file structure. JSON actually allows me to encapsulate multiple table definitions inside a single file. Now this happens to be a pretty simple JSON document, but it's a good example of the way multi-level or hierarchical data can be structured inside of a structured document like this. So if I were to click on the record link for either of the items that I see in the file description metadata that I see here, it would actually create a navigation step. So for example, if I were to click on record under metadata, it would actually navigate down to that portion of the file, and you see that it adds a navigation step. Well, I look at this data and I see that that's not really the data that I wanted, so I don't want to do that. Since I'm just discovering the structure of my file at this point, what I can do is just click outside of the link in the same cell. We'll go ahead and look at the metadata first, and I can see in the preview down at the bottom of this window that that's not my data. It's just metadata that describes the file when it was created and the create time. But if I go up to this cell, you can see that that in fact is my data. Okay, so that's what I want. So I'll go ahead and click on the record, and that actually navigates me to that part of the JSON file. But you can see that it's actually a record at this point. It needs to be converted into a table. So I'll click the only button that you can click on the Convert group in the Record Tools ribbon tab, and that converts that into a table. As before, you can see that the first row needs to be promoted to headers. So we'll use the Use First Row as Headers button. This is on the Home tab of the ribbon, by the way. Use First Row as Headers. Again, I'm going to double check that my data types are correct. That one is text, that one is number. I'm just going to be particular about the order of the columns, not that it's critical. But in the other files, my code or identifier is the first column. So I'm going to grab the code column, just drag that over in front of the delay group column. This is a whole number, which is fine. Those are all integer values. And this is a text, which is exactly what I want. And so I'm good with that. So we've imported all of my lookup or dimension table files at this point. Now we're going to import our fact data. So I'm going to drop down the New Source button. Note that I'm using the arrow below the button to drop down this list. What I want is not there. I want to use a folder full of similar structured files as a single data source. So I click More, and you can see there's my folder option right there. So I'll go ahead and click Connect after selecting folder. What this is going to do is it's going to use the folder as a data source. And so the query designer will actually get all of those files, and it will automatically look at the first file, get all of the column information, and then allow me to import all of the data in that folder based on the column descriptions of the first file that it finds. Now, there are very sophisticated things that I can do with this feature, but we're just going to use it in a very simple form. So we'll go ahead and go down to my C drive and to my data folder, into fact data. We're going to import the 2016 data. That's 12 files in that folder. Click OK. You can see that it will read the files, and so it's just looking at the files at this point, not the contents of the files. But I can use the Combine and Edit button because I know that all of these files have the same structure. They all have the same columns with the same column names, the same data types in the same order. So I know that I can safely combine these files. So I'm going to say Combine and Edit. There's my preview. I'll go ahead and click OK. Now you can see that there were several queries and functions created automatically by the query designer. For our purposes, we're not going to worry about that. Just know that a lot of heavy lifting and hard work has been done for you automatically by the query editor. Notice that there were a number of steps applied that broke this work down for us and made it very simple. We're going to explore that in the advanced course. I want to rename this file. It just used the folder as my file name, so I'm going to call this query or table in the target data model on-time performance. I just want to point out that I'm making a point to use mixed case, and I'm also making a point to use spaces in my names. You can use your own naming conventions. Just make sure that you're consistent and very deliberate about the way that you name things. My rationale for naming conventions is that I'm preparing a user experience. I want the user to see friendly names, things that are familiar to them, and so I typically use mixed case and spaces for my table names and column names. All right. I'm going to maximize this table. I'm going to maximize this window so that we have a little more screen real estate to work with. Keep in mind that the Query Editor window is on top of the Power BI desktop window. Also keep in mind that I haven't saved anything yet. So we have some work that has not been committed to disk or storage at this point. I'm going to maximize that window. I don't need this source name. That's not important information for me. So I can right-click on that column and say Remove. Now we're going to remove several columns, and that's one way that I can remove a column, just by right-clicking and choosing Remove. But I can also select only the columns that I want to keep, which I'll do a little later on. Now, I want to think about the columns that I need to expose to my users, as opposed to the columns that will be used as keys to relate to key columns and other lookup tables. Flight date, later on we're going to actually create a flight date lookup table, but in this first phase of our kind of simple form of the exercise, I am going to expose this column, so I'll rename that to flight date. Press enter after making a change. Unique carrier, I don't need. I'm going to get rid of that. Airline ID, I do need, but we're going to hide this column, so I'm not going to rename that. This carrier column, we don't need. Tail number, yes, we can use that. Flight number is useful information. Origin and destination will actually be keys that we'll use to point to their respective lookup tables. So I'll actually hide those columns in this table. So I'm not going to rename them. And there are several other columns that I'm not going to take the time to walk you through, but I'm just going to go rename each of those that I care about. And I'll speed up the playback so that you don't have to sit and watch me do that. And arrival delay are particularly important columns. So I just wanted to point those out. I also want to point out that even though these are integer values consistently throughout the files, that the designer decided to mark them as decimals, and we're actually going to change that. I'll come back to that after I've renamed everything. All right, you saw me make all of those changes, albeit quickly. I'm going to review each of the columns that I changed and explain why I changed some of them and not others. Unique carrier is a column that I don't care about. I'm going to get rid of it. Airline ID is a column that I do care about, but I'm going to hide it because it's essentially a foreign key, so I don't need to rename it. Now this is a very large table, and I chose to use this table because it's realistic. It's common to have a lot of columns that you need to rename, change data types, etc. So we're going to use the Choose Columns list, which you can get to with this little icon in the upper left-hand corner of the table designer. And if you'd like, you can pause the recording, and you'll see in this list all of the column names that I changed. Those that I changed are just friendly names, and those that I've left are either columns that we're going to hide or the columns that we can get rid of here. Let's deselect everything just so we can be deliberate about what we want to leave remaining. Flight date I need. Unique character I do not. Airline ID I do. Tail number I do. Flight number, origin, dest, and any of those columns that I have renamed. So you'll see the mixed case and spaces, and that gives me a real easy way to pick the columns that I care about, that I want to choose. Arrival delay group, we'll go ahead and keep that. I may or may not use it. Canceled. Airtime, distance, carrier delay, weather delay, NAS delay, security delay, late aircraft delay. All right, and you can stop the recording and review the rest of those if you need to. I'll go ahead and click OK. And then the last thing that I want to do is double check the data type of each of these columns. This is always tedious work. It really can't be automated, and so you need to be very diligent about reviewing your column names. Make sure that you're promoting first row as column headers, and check the data type of every column. So flight date is good, airline ID is good. You can see that that's a whole number. If you go over to either the home ribbon or the transform ribbon, you can see the actual data type. So you can see that that's a date. You can also click on this icon, and there you can see that it's a date just based on the icon. So I'm just going to move over until I see a data type that needs to be changed. So you can see that there are a number of numeric columns that were marked as decimals, and I know that these are whole minutes. Every one of them will always be a whole value. So I'm just going to start with the first column that I see 1.2, which means that that's a decimal. I don't want it to be a decimal. I want it to be a whole number. I'm holding down the control key. I'm going to select departure delay, taxi out, and then I'm just going to look for any other columns that have that 1.2 icon. And I'm still holding down control as I select all of these columns. Canceled is actually going to be a true false, so I'll I'll not select that one. I'll go back and change it explicitly to a Boolean or true false later. All right, so I have all of essentially my times and my delay minutes still holding down control. And now I'm going to go up to the home ribbon, and I'm going to change the decimal number to whole number, which will convert all of these to whole numbers. And then I want to go back and change canceled to a true false. And let's just make sure that we have everything else typed correctly. We do, and that's great. All right, I'm now ready to import this data. Before I do that, and I know that this is going to take some time because every year there are about 6 million flights, so we have a lot of data to import. I want to make sure that I save my work. So I'm going to click on the little floppy disk icon to save. That's going to prompt me for a file name. Now, you can see that Power BI Desktop is prompting me to apply the changes before I save. I'm going to say apply later. I'm only doing that so that I can show you explicitly how you close and apply. So I'm just going to say apply later so that I can give this a name. I want to store this file in my reports folder, and we'll call it airline performance lab 01 and click save. All right, now I'm going to choose close and apply. On the home ribbon, on the far left side, drop down, close and apply, and click close and apply, which is going to close the query editor, and then it's going to import data from all of those files into tables in our data model. And you can see that there are a number of small files that import very quickly, and then we're going to be waiting a while on the on-time performance table because it has to iterate through all 12 of those very large CSV files. I sped up the playback just in the interest of time. You can see that all 12 of those files have been imported. Now we're going to very quickly finish this so that we have a working data model. I'd like you to switch to the relationships icon over on the left side of Power BI Desktop at the bottom. And you can see that a couple of relationships were created by the designer. It did create one relationship that is correct between the on-time performance table, airline ID, and the ID column in the airline table. So you can go ahead and leave that one. However, between the destination airport and the origin airport, this relationship doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to click on that line and press delete on my keyboard, confirm that I want to delete that. And then we can go ahead and just rearrange these tables. There are only 4 of them. But I'm going to put them in logical order, and I'm going to drag from the origin column in the on-time performance table to the code column in the origin airport table. Same thing from dest in the on-time performance table to the code column in the destination airport table. That creates the relationships that we need in this very simple first iteration of our model, which gives us a good stopping point to get to our next exercise. Go ahead and click the floppy disk to save your work, and we'll continue in a few moments.